Welcome to Week 6, Part 1 of World History since 1500. This week we're going to be discussing the nationalist and imperialist revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries post-Napoleonic Wars. First, let's look at a couple of definitions, or at least if we're not defining them, exactly clearly, your readings will help you do that. And I might also note that imperialism and nationalism, the definitions of these have been fought over for years and years, and like everything else, historians have differing opinions. The transition that we're using here from last week when we looked at industrialization and urbanization, and we talked about the shrinking world and the development of steamships and steamboats and railroads and telegraphs, those all enabled people, particularly Europeans, to develop, exploit, and administer empires. So the growth of colonies and empires is what we're going to be discussing in terms of imperialism. On the other hand, nations themselves were forging themselves into nation states that resembled what we know today, for instance, in Italy and Germany and the like. And these nation states were based upon ethnic or cultural foundations for the most part. First of all, we're going to look at nationalist efforts in Latin America. This map shows Latin America before independence movements, and so you recall that mainly Spain and Portugal controlled Latin America in colonies. So too did others like the French and the Dutch and the British, but mainly Spain and Portugal. First, let's start with some basic definitions because it's very important to understand the concept of race in Latin America. The Creoles, or Creoles, were people of Spanish descent born in Latin America. The Peninsulares were people born in the Iberian Peninsula, that is Spain or Portugal, and they had moved, of course, to Latin America. And the Peninsulares were generally dominant economically and politically. They held the reins of power. And so there would be a bit of resentment by the Creoles against the Peninsulares for their economic and political dominance. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, there was a mixture of races and backgrounds in Latin America. Mestizos were people of mixed Spanish and Indian background. Mulattoes, people of mixed Spanish and African background. And the mestizos and mulattoes, of course, were generally toward the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. They generally performed the hard manual labor. And then, of course, there were the Indians and slaves at the very bottom of this socioeconomic ladder. Already by the late 1600s and the early 1700s, the Latin American colonies of Spain were becoming more self-sufficient in things like agriculture and certain consumer products. That's going to change here. Remember, we talked about the War of the Spanish Succession, which brought about the Bourbon dynasty of France to rule Spain. The Bourbon dynasty enacted reforms intended to make the Spanish colonies provide raw materials for Spain, and the Spanish colonies would then be expected to buy Spanish consumer goods or Spanish finished goods. This is, of course, what the mercantilist system was all about. To enable this, the Bourbon dynasty, for example, lowered Latin American import duties, which actually end up ruining much of Latin America's infant industry. And more, the Latin American colonies began to look like a colonial economy. And a colonial economy is just that, kind of providing raw materials for another country, which then takes the raw materials, produces consumer goods, and sells them back to the colonies. For instance, the production of coffee became prominent in Venezuela, of sugar in Cuba and throughout the Caribbean, hides, leather, and salted beef in the Rio de la Plata Viceroyalty, In Mexico and Peru, production of silver continued to climb. And so the result of many of these actions was that Spain's trade with her colonies soared, possibly as much as 700% between 1778 and 1788, just 10 short years. But then the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars occurred, and Spain discovered two things. Number one, it could not keep the sea lanes open. It could not prevent the United States and other neutral powers from trading with Latin America. And finally, in 1796, Spain just up and recognized that and allowed neutral countries to trade with the Spanish colonies. Number two, these French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars necessitated an increase in defense spending, and Spain felt that her colonies, should pay part of these increased costs. So Spain began to increase prices on their monopolies on tobacco and liquor, and also increased a sales tax, which, the name is of Arabic origin, the alcabala, a sales tax. These new taxes were especially hard on those on the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder, for instance, the Indians. And then also the law of repartimiento required Indians to buy goods only from local corregidores. Those were officials who collected taxes. The Indians were also subject to forced labor. Not surprisingly, not everyone in the colonies of Spain and Portugal were happy with what was happening. By the late 1700s, the Creoles were becoming increasingly upset that the Peninsulares controlled the government. And the Creoles were beginning to become more and more familiar with Enlightenment writers and philosophy and ideas of government of their day. And they resented the lack of socioeconomic and political power. In the Andes Mountains, the Indians themselves resisted and rebelled from the 1740s until the 1780s against Spain. One of the leaders there, his name was Jose Gabriel Condorcanqui. He claimed descent from the Inca rulers and took the name Tupac Amaru II. He led a massive insurrection in Peru beginning in 1780. The rebels wanted the end of forced labor, the end of the law of repartimiento, and better working conditions. Tupac Amaru II was captured and executed, but the rebellion took several years to quell, and 100,000 people died. The government did eventually abolish the repartimiento system. In New Granada, the Comunero Revolution occurred in what is now modern Colombia. It was a revolt against taxation that began in 1781. Each town involved elected a commune, hence the name of the revolution, or a central committee, which had a militia and a captain. This rebellion, too, was also quelled. A successful rebellion occurred in a French-owned colony of Haiti. There, Toussaint Louverture led a successful revolution. The revolt began in 1789, the same year of the French Revolution when it began, when the Creoles refused the mulattoes representation in the local assemblies and in the French National Assembly. Louverture, a self-educated freed slave, led the revolt, and the U.S. government aided the rebels. In 1804, Haiti became independent, the second nation in the Western Hemisphere to gain its independence. The first nation in the Western Hemisphere to gain its independence was the United States. In 1808, Napoleon deposed Spanish King Ferdinand VII and placed his, that is, Napoleon's brother, on the throne. The Creoles back in Latin America claimed that sovereignty now had shifted to the people, a very Enlightenment idea, because the king was deposed. After the Napoleonic Wars, wars for revolution began in earnest throughout Latin America. One of the great revolutionary leaders was named Simón Bolívar. He is in fact called the father of Latin American independence. He gained independence for Greater Colombia, called Gran Colombia. He also fought for the independence of Peru, and he created the Republic of Bolivia, which was named for him. Gran Colombia eventually splintered into 3 countries, Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. Upset, Bolivar went into exile and stated, quote, that America is ungovernable. Those who served the revolution plowed the seas, end quote. In Brazil, which was a Portuguese colony, Napoleon took over Portugal, and the royal family of Portugal fled to Brazil, and indeed made Rio de Janeiro the capital of the Portuguese Empire. The Portuguese king even supported independence in 1822 and permitted a constitution for Brazil. The aftermath of the revolutions in Latin America were not always as people had planned. As one historian said, the crown had, quote, served as a unifying symbol, and its disappearance left a power vacuum. Civil disorder typically followed. The Creole leaders of the revolutions had no experience in government, and the wars left a legacy of military, not civilian leadership, end quote. Dictatorial or authoritarian rule often arose in this vacuum. This dictatorial rule was called caudillismo. It emerged, and as military dictatorships abounded, so did coups d'etats, and the wars in Latin America eventually hurt the economy. Another thing that hurt Latin America was the imperialist efforts of those countries like the United States and Great Britain and other places. And while they had not necessarily, these countries, taken over areas as colonies, they had established a neocolonialism. What do we mean by neocolonialism? By neocolonialism, we mean that U.S. Americans, the British, and other nations and their corporations invested heavily in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Latin American agriculture, railroads, mines, banks, etc. And that meant that the U.S. and Britain would sometimes intervene in the political affairs of these Latin American countries. The U.S., for instance, intervened in Panama, Nicaragua, and Haiti in the early 20th century to ensure political stability for our economic interest. In places like Mexico, meanwhile, more and more land fell into the hands of fewer and fewer people. Large landed estates, called haciendas, grew, whereby the Indians were swindled out of their property, or if the Indians couldn't produce deeds for their property was simply taken from them. And they were put into a situation of debt peonage, whereby landowners paid their laborers not in cash, but in vouchers. Vouchers redeemable only at the company store. And the company store, of course, had high prices and tricky bookkeeping that would always keep the peons permanently in debt. Besides all of this, Latin America received many immigrants in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Many Europeans, including Germans and Italians, and Asians, including those from India, Japan, and China, settled in Latin America, particularly in countries like Argentina, which ended up having a very diverse population base. This is a map showing what Latin America essentially looked like after the beginning in 1830, after several of the revolutions had taken place. And you see, of course, up here, Gran Colombia and Bolivia, etc. Well, nationalistic efforts were also occurring throughout Europe. And so Greece, which had long been a part of the Ottoman Empire, rebelled against the Ottoman Empire, which by this time was in decline and was being called the sick man of Europe. The 8-year rebellion enabled Greece to gain its independence. Belgium. When we had left off with Belgium in the Congress of Vienna in 1815, ending the Napoleonic Wars, Belgium had been united with the Netherlands in a single nation state, but the Belgians rebelled in 1830 and won their own independence. Italy, which had been divided for many years into different provinces and by many different imperial powers, including the Holy Roman Empire, was now unified in the 1860s under the direction of Cavour, Prime Minister of the Piedmont of the Kingdom of Sardinia, and by 1861, when the Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed. And of course, Germany became unified in the 1860s and the 1870s. It was unified by Otto von Bismarck, Prime Minister of Prussia. Bismarck was an adherent of Realpolitik, a pragmatic political philosophy whereby the end justified the means. Prussia helped to forge German unity and add to its territory by waging three principal wars: the Danish War of 1864, the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. At the end of the latter, the German Empire, what we call the Second German Reich, was proclaimed. Russia also tried to expand its territory and was successful into the Balkan Peninsula at the expense of the ailing Ottoman Empire. It also was always in search of a warm water port, namely the Black Sea, for its warships and its commerce. In pursuit of her goals, Russia fought the Russo-Turkish War of 1828-29, the Crimean War of 1853-56, which pitted every major European power against Russia, and the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78. There were also nationalistic movements among peoples of the Balkan Peninsula. We'll discuss these in Week 7. So here we show you a map at the left of the unification of Italy and on the right of the unification of Germany, showing the boundaries in red of Germany as of 1871. Well, let's talk just a little bit about the United States, where both nationalism and imperialism was occurring. In the United States, manifest destiny was the belief that the U.S. was destined by Providence to expand from shore to shore. This actual term, manifest destiny, was first expressed in a magazine article in 1845 in relation to the annexation of Texas. Well, Texas was actually it declared its own independence from Spain in 1836. And then it wished to be annexed by the United States in 1845. The Mexican-American War occurred at that time between 1845 and 1848, which was a victory for the United States. And by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States acquired New Mexico and California and the rest of Texas. If this showed the imperialism of the United States, then the American Civil War showed the nationalism of the United States. Obviously, the United States had still not built itself as a nation state of one people and one idea. And the American Civil War showed that as the country split apart into a Union and a Confederate States of America. During that war, Abraham Lincoln proclaimed in 1863 an Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in the states in rebellion against the United States. As the United States, by the end of the Civil War, achieved at least one nation state and its nationalist goals, it was free to pursue more imperialistic goals later on, particularly in the Spanish-American War of 1898. This short-lived war resulted in the U.S. acquiring from Spain Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippine Islands. This shows a scene from the Mexican-American War, and this shows a map of the territory. In fact, it was some of the best territory, geographically speaking, in terms of agriculture, etc., that Mexico lost to the United States in 1848. Well, we also know that nationalism was occurring in Canada. After the Treaty of Paris in 1763, ending the 7 Years' War, which we've already discussed, Canada became a British colony. In 1867, a little more than 100 years later, the Dominion of Canada was established, a self-governing nation within the British Empire. That is, Canada was in charge of its internal affairs, while Britain remained in control of Canada's foreign affairs until 1931. Australia. In 1770, James Cook, an English explorer, declared possession of Australia for King George III. British prisons were so full that the English established a penal colony in Australia in 1786 through 1788 and continued to do so for the next 80 years. Eventually, Australia became a commercial colony of Britain, specializing in seals, wool, and wheat. Gold was discovered there in the 1850s. A subsequent gold rush occurred, and a vast railroad construction was pursued. And finally, the Commonwealth of Australia was established in 1901, and this was a Commonwealth nation within the British Empire, holding a special relationship, as all Commonwealth nations, with Great Britain, its mother country. Well, let's talk a little bit about India now, and we'll start with Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan is remembered as the Mughal ruler who built the Taj Mahal, a magnificent tomb for his favorite wife. Interesting, the original plan called for a second building just like the Taj Mahal, except in black, to be built facing it. And for some reason, the second structure was never built. India then, about 1500, was subject to invasions of the Mughals. They were Islamic Turkish Muslims under the leader Babur, who ruled from 1527 to 1530. Babur was a descendant of the great conqueror Timur, called Tamerlane by Europeans, and Babur's grandson was Akbar. Akbar tried to unite India by marrying a Hindu, incorporating Hindus into his administration, and founding a new religion which was a curious mix of Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism. It was Akbar's grandson who built the Taj Mahal as a tomb for his wife. Well, the Portuguese, the French, and the British all arrived to trade and established trading posts in India, as we've already discussed. And by the 18th century AD, that is the 1700s, the Mughal Empire in India began to disintegrate. Due to a variety of things, weak rulers, religious intolerance, they attempted really to convert everyone to Islam, destroying Hindu temples, and a succession crisis leading to a civil war. When we talked about the 7 Years' War and the Treaty of Paris of 1763 ending it, we said that Britain received basically India except for two places, Pondicherry and Kandanagar. British trade with India, and here we show the British annexation or conquest of India in map form. British trade with India was controlled by a charter monopoly, that is a for-profit company called the British East India Company. The British slowly took over India piece by piece. The British East India Company had major settlements in India, each of these with forts and warehouses, residents, and even their own law courts, and military servants as well. Facing bankruptcy in the 1770s, the British East India Company secured a loan from the Bank of England. Under the subsequent Regulating Act of 1773, all business in India was to be overseen by a Governor-General in Calcutta. And 11 years later, the British Parliament established a 6-man Board of Control, including 2 members of Parliament, to sit above the company's directors. In 1857-1858, the Sepoy Mutiny occurred. This mutiny began with a rumor that was spread among the Sepoys. Now, the Sepoys were the British East India Company's soldiers They were native soldiers of India, so they were Muslim and Hindu. And the rumor was that the cartridges for the guns being used by the sepoys were being greased with pig and cow fat. Now, pigs were considered unclean by the Muslims, and cows were considered sacred by the Hindus. And so a mutiny broke out. It lasted 5 months, and in 1858, it led to the official end of the Mughal dynasty as the British government assumed direct control of India. Literally, Queen Victoria of Britain was proclaimed Empress of India. Throughout the 20th century, there was an effort to gain independence for India led by Mahatma Gandhi, who resisted the British with nonviolence and civil disobedience. His rival was Muhammad Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League, which feared Hindu domination should India receive its independence. Instead, Jinnah proposed the creation of a separate Muslim state. In 1947, Britain granted independence to 2 countries then, to India, which was Hindu, and Pakistan, which was Muslim. In January of 1948, Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu. His legacy was great. Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States, in reference to his own campaign of nonviolent resistance to civil rights abuses, later stated that Christ gave me the message, Gandhi gave me the method. A saying of Gandhi perhaps sums up his life best. In the midst of death, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists. In the midst of darkness, light persists. Hence I gather that God is life, truth, light. He is love. He is the supreme good. And this shows, of course, the independence of British India into 2 separate states, India and Pakistan. Well, we're going to talk a little bit now about Asia. We had talked a little bit about the Ming Dynasty when we last left off with Asia and about its worldwide voyages under the eunuch Zheng He, and how the Ming Dynasty was eventually replaced by the Qing Dynasty, which lasted from 1644 to 1911, 1912. Like all good things, the Qing Dynasty would eventually come to an end and decline. But first of all, we want to discuss just a little bit about, again, how the Qing Dynasty was started. It was started by Manchus from Manchuria, and as one historian says, they settled in China like a race of lords destined to reign over a population of slaves. They reached probably the apogee of their power in the 18th century in terms of economy. It was a very prosperous economy in the 1700s. There was a flourishing textile industry and tea plantations and ceramic, sugar, paper manufactories, etc. And we already know that the population by 1812 of China was some 360 million people. The Qing Dynasty began to decline from what we've talked about in our first lecture, implosion. That is kind of a weakening at the core, and we can say not only a weakening at the core, but then, if not outright invasions, at least imperialism coming from imperialistic powers outside. The cost of its own foreign expansion was a problem for the Qing Dynasty. The cost of its army, corruption, and of course a host of European and other imperialism. One of these imperialistic efforts was surrounded or focused on the opium trade. In the 1780s, the British introduced opium into China. Now, opium was grown in India, and while the British East India Company said, we are not bringing opium into China, you have to remember that all of the sailors who were sailing with the British East India Company were allowed to bring a certain amount of goods to sell in China in their own personal chest, that they would have on board the ship. And so the sailors themselves would buy the opium grown in India, and then they would end up, when they went into Chinese ports, little Chinese junkets would come out into the port area and board the ship, and the opium would be traded. By the early 1800s, China had an unfavorable balance of trade, and China was also very upset that this opium trade was going on and that the Chinese were becoming addicted, many of them, to opium. It led to the First Opium War of 1839 through 42, which was concluded by the Treaty of Nanjing, whereby China ceded the island of Hong Kong to the British, agreed to pay the British 21 million silver dollars, and agreed to open more ports to the British. So this is when Britain got a hold of Hong Kong. During the Sino-Japanese War, a war between China and Japan, and a war that Japan won, China gave Taiwan to Japan, and it was also forced to recognize the independence of Korea. During the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, China lost most of southern Manchuria to Russia. So as you can see, bits and pieces of China are falling off. Britain was obtaining treaty ports like Hong Kong. Russia had moved into Manchuria, the Japanese into Taiwan, Korea was independent, etc. Besides all of this, there was increasing difficulty in the interior of China as well, in what was called the Taiping Rebellion of 1850 to 1864. It was a popular revolution of religious, social, and economic origin, and its leader was Hong Xiuquan, who had studied with an American Protestant missionary and thought of himself as the younger brother of Jesus. This was a massive rebellion. There were other rebellions and uprisings that lasted until 1875 in China, and the results were astonishing. The Taiping and subsequent rebellions really constituted a civil war in China, causing great destruction in property and lives. The losses in human lives, said one historian, were unparalleled in history. The exact figure is unknown, but the most reasonable estimates vary between 20 and 30 million people dead. This, again, is a map showing how the Russians, Japanese, French, British, German all began to make incursions into China, and also showing the areas of certain rebellions like the Taiping Rebellion as well as the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion occurred in 1900. The Chinese Boxers were anti-foreign and anti-Christian, and they began to attack Chinese Christians. The major European powers, and also the United States, sent more than 20,000 men and many warships to China to protect their economic interest and their embassies in Beijing. So the rebellion was squelched, and unfortunately it had to be squelched by European and American powers. At that time, for all intents and purposes, the widow of an emperor who had wormed her way into power by the name of Cixi, she was an empress dowager, had pretty well led China into a great deal of corruption and was the pulling the strings of a puppet emperor. So again, internally, the situation in China was falling apart as well. Well, what about Japan? Japan is an interesting place because basically it was never really successfully invaded until the time of World War II. A shogun was the major ruler for years and years in Japan during medieval times. The Mongols had attempted twice to invade Japan in 1274 and 1281, and these were just huge invasions by sea, but the Mongols were blown away both times by basically hurricane winds. And so the Japanese began to call those winds divine winds, literally in Japanese, kamikaze. Later on, you'll note that in World War II, the kamikaze pilots, we say here in the United States, take that same derivation of their name from the divine wind that blew the Mongols away twice in 1874 and 1281. In 1331, there was the beginning of a certain family of shoguns called the Ashikaga, and there was civil war that lasted up through 1600s, called the Warring States period. And then in 1600, a very, very interesting thing happened in Japan. The Tokugawa family was victorious, and they became the shoguns. They became the most powerful military and political leaders in Japan. They ruled during the Tokugawa period for 268 years, and they end up controlling in a kind of a feudal system the lords or the daimyo below them. They were great supporters of Confucianism, and in a really interesting move, they advocated isolationism. That is, they literally, from the 1630s to the 1850s, made all foreigners, including Christian missionaries, leave Japan. Only a few Dutch traders were allowed to stay on an island in the port of the city of Nagasaki, and with a few ships per year trade with the Japanese. Also, only a few Chinese were allowed to trade annually with the Japanese. So all foreigners were made to leave except for a few Chinese and Dutch. No Japanese were allowed to leave Japan without permission. No Japanese were allowed guns. The shoguns took away all guns. And this was possible because Japan was an island country, and it did something that no country I know of in world history did, and that is for a 250-year period, it closed its doors, basically, to the rest of the world. By 1854, Commodore Perry of the United States came in to the Edo Bay, Tokyo Bay, and forced Japan to open its doors to trade. A commercial treaty was signed between Japan and the U.S., and Japanese themselves, who saw this as a weakness on the part of the shogun and saw the strength of the outsiders, decided that they had to do something. And so they brought back, after many, many years, a restoration of the emperor, the Japanese emperor, and his political power. While Japan always had an emperor, the emperor was always more of a figurehead and was involved in religious ceremonies and things of that sort. But in 1868, they decided to bring the emperor back in what was called the Meiji Restoration of the emperor and his political power. Here we see Japan in some of the acquisitions that she will obtain during the 19th century in her own imperialistic ventures. We've mentioned some of those already. In 1894-95, Japan fought a war with China and Japan over Korea. Japan won and received Taiwan. In 1904-05, in the Russo-Japanese War, Japan fought Russia and won, gaining a protectorate over Port Arthur in the area of Manchuria. In 1910, Japan just outright annexed Korea. In 1931, it invaded Manchuria in China, and then, of course, this whole rest of the stuff we're going to discuss later on, but we know what happens. The Japanese will attack Pearl Harbor, and there, of course, will occur World War II, and eventually the only time that Japan had been invaded was by the United States. But this is for a story later on. We also then can talk just a little bit about Korea, which had many influences from China, just like Japan, including Buddhism and Confucianism. Korea was a highly stratified society. Hereditary aristocrats called Yangban owned most of the land and held most of the government posts. Slaves were about 30% of the population, a very high proportion, by the way. The Goryeo dynasty, where we get the name Korea, ruled from 935 to 1392. The Mongols invaded in 1231, but allowed the Goryeo kings to rule, but as subordinates to the Mongols. In the 1300s, Japanese pirates raided the eastern coast and advanced inland, mainly in the south, and a Korean general by the name of Yi Song-gi overcame the Japanese, staged a coup with the help of China, and established the Joseon dynasty, or the Yi dynasty of Korea. And that is the important dynasty for our time period. The other was just background information. 1392 to 1910, the Joseon dynasty made its capital at Seoul and invented a new alphabet for the Korean language. It was a tributary state to China. Japan invaded Korea in 1592 and again in 1596. With Chinese help, the Japanese were repulsed. 2 million died, and it took a century for agriculture in Korea to recover. In 1627 and 1637, Manchus invaded Korea and made it a tributary state, even before the Manchus defeated China and became the Qing dynasty. Between 1750 and 1790, the slave population dropped in Korea from about 30% to about 5% of the population due to economic and philosophical changes. By the late 19th century, as we've already talked about, Korea was caught in a vise between China, Japan, and Russia. Japan forced the Koreans to open some ports for trade, followed by Europeans, etc. A religious movement in Korea of the 1860s and following, called the Tonghak movement, led to internal weaknesses. The movement was popular among the peasants, broke out in a massive rebellion in 1894 when Korea and Japan both sent forces with the ostensible justification of helping the Koreans. However, the Chinese and Japanese began to fight one another, so that by the next year, Korea became a Japanese protectorate, and by 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea. And we'll next talk about Cold War Korea when we get to the 20th century. Vietnam. Vietnam was conquered, Nam Viet, by Chinese armies in 111 BC. China remained in control of most of it until 939 AD, when the Vietnamese became independent. The Mongols invaded Vietnam, but were not successful and were repulsed. The Ming Dynasty of China invaded Vietnam in 1406, but Vietnam became independent again a few years later and drove the Chinese out. The Vietnamese marched to the sea in the 1600s. They took the Mekong River Delta from the Khmer Kingdom and divided into 2 and then 3 kingdoms. Vietnam was a tributary for many years of China and was under control of the Nguyen Dynasty. In the Sino-French War of 1884-85, Vietnam became a part of the French colonial empire. And of course, the French also ruled in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. Finally, the Philippines. Ferdinand Magellan had circumnavigated the world in 1519 and 22, claimed it as a Spanish colony, the Philippines. They became important in maritime trade between China and the New World in silver, silk, porcelain, etc. In the Spanish-American War, the U.S. gained the Philippines, and they held an insurrection against the United States, which was not successful from 1898 to 1902, and finally, obviously on July 4th for a good reason, and 1946 after World War II would get their independence from the United States. The rest of the lecture is continued as part 2. Thank you and have a good day.